Welcome to the Integral Stage Sexuality Series. I'm Layman Pascal, and before I host my high-priced week-long workshop on integrative sexuality at a seaside Caribbean resort, I need to make sure I've been fully exposed to the multidimensional richness and profundity of this topic. A topic that most people find deeply physically compelling, emotionally significant, and for some people intellectually fascinating and brimming with spiritual and developmental potential. Here to share the ins and outs of their understanding is... Okay, tell us who you are and where you are.
Hi, I'm Pamela Joy. I'm a sex and relationship coach out of San Jose, California, and I am currently in the office space above my garage.
I thought we could start really abstractly. What is desire? What do all desires have in common? What does desire do for us?
Ooh, I like that. Especially because I work with people who consider themselves to have low or no desire, right? Gosh, what is desire? I'm looking down and almost wanting to close my eyes because for me, at least when I've tapped into, I think there's the desires that I've been maybe culturally or socially told that I'm supposed to want, right? And those I don't have to look very deep internally to find. They're very much in my head and things that I've been told. But I think I have this desire to close my eyes and go inward to source kind of those desires that are actually unique to me and not culturally or socially told to me. It's almost like they reside in the body as opposed to something that's in my head.
Do you think of them as, to what degree do you think they're built in? Like we just explore and we discover what our desires happen to be, and to what degree are we experimenting, making them up,
My little puppy desires to be picked up on my lap, so I'm picking her up. Should you say hi? Okay.
Oh, hi.
I'm a big experimentalist, so I definitely find both with myself and with the clients that I work with that, and maybe this goes back to the answer to the first question, right? Is I think we're really trained to be in our brains, and so if there is some wisdom that resides in the body to also help us navigate what these desires are, and we're so used to being in our brain, maybe they are kind of built into our systems. But I think that experimenting can be a good way to either discover something new or to find that built in. So I guess I'm not 100% sure, to what degree they're built in, but I do love the idea of experimentation, this idea of try something and I happen to just be moving back and forth as I'm describing this, because I'm try something and see if you lean in towards it, right? Or try something and see if your body kind of constricts and pulls back, and that is a good indication if that is something that you might desire.
That's a nice feature, that there's this because that's kind of a safe laboratory just to check how your body is responding in a moment, because one of the questions I think that could come up around people exploring and clarifying and trying to recognize their desires is the question of how do they know when their desire is going to work well with their other values, and when is a desire going to be disruptive, and how do you test it before it gets out of hand?
Yeah, I like that. It's like an inner lab, right? Where you're just okay, what do even if I just think about that, or if I make one little step towards that, do I feel some ease? And then it's also a little step, right? Because how does that integrate, or how does that fit? Or do I have the voice to associate with that thing that I want, or confidence to not get knocked off when it might become challenging? Or
I love this phrase, desire discrepancy. Makes me think of, I don't know if you've seen it, there's a scene in the Woody Allen movie, I think Annie Hall, and it's a split screen, and they're both at their therapist, but it's filmed as one scene, right? And both their therapists say, how often do you have sex? And she says, all the time, 3 times a week. And he says, almost never, 3 times a week.
Yeah, that is actually a very real scene. I work primarily with couples, and oh my goodness, yeah, that is yeah, it's just our perception of reality and what that looks like is so different. Yeah, and it's so common, right? If you have two people, of course there's going to, almost always, of course, there's going to be a discrepancy, right? It's like very unlikely that two people are going to be exactly the same. There's going to be some difference between the two of them.
There's a book on I think The Art of Raising a Puppy. It might be called. These monks breed and sell dogs. And in the beginning of the book, it said a lot of people think the most important thing is how you train the dog. He said, and that's true, but the most important thing before that is whether it's a breed who can be accommodated by your lifestyle. So there's this basic type difference that you might not be able to get around, but on top of that, there might be all this work that you can do to make it work a lot better. When do you see, when you're working with people, when do you get a sense of, no matter what these two people do, they're never going to be quite close enough to be viscerally satisfying for both of them?
That's a great question. I'm going to answer it in two parts, both from a wiring of how does desire and arousal show up in someone's body when we're talking about like erotic desire and arousal, and then also kind of the psychological things that we get out of sex and how those may or may not be wired similarly, right? Or complementary. So when it comes to like how desire and arousal shows up in our body, there's actually some books behind me. One of them is called Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. And she does a really nice description in that book of what I would consider two of the primary kind of models for how desire and arousal shows up. One of these is this idea of like spontaneous desire and arousal. These are the people who walk through life and they can kind of just like be met with a sexual stimulus and go from like 0 to 100%. So if we were to like chart this would look like a step function. You're going along, you're not available for sex, you get some stimulus, you're 100% available for sex. And so, this looks like big arousal and desire. It shows up quickly, it shows up fully. And I think this is what we get modeled in the movies, right? It's like the sweep off the desk sudden thing. It's just these people who are very available and very in touch with their body and desire. So that's one way it can be wired. I would say like maybe half the clients, and it's not gender specific, but just like half my clients kind of fall into that category. Then the other half of the population has this model that's in the academic literature, at least, is called responsive desire. And how this shows up, if I were to chart it, is like a really slow curve. It goes up and to the right. Hopefully that's up and to the right on the screen here. And for these people, there's kind of a gym analogy as well. So let's say you're the type of person that always has your bag packed. Someone says, you want to go to the gym? And you're like, yeah, let's go. They're like very excited even before they get to the gym. Then responsive desire and arousal, or responsive gym people, are the people that like in the middle of the workout go, oh yeah, this is good. I don't know why I don't want to go to the gym more often. Or maybe even at the end of the workout, they will see that. And people who have responsive desire and arousal, erotically speaking, also have that similar experience. It's like, maybe if you ask them if they wanted to have sex right in the beginning, they would just kind of say no, like why, and it takes some like very like a lot of layering of really nice stimulus to get them to that point. Not that they don't have desire arousal, it just shows up smaller to start and it grows over time if given the right not shutting down type of interaction. And so the first part of the answer to your question is yes. Can these two people learn to navigate relationship if one is one way and one is the other, which is very common? Yes, they can, right? The person who has this spontaneous desire and arousal, it's kind of getting back to that, like leaning forward back. Like for that person, when they lean too forward with their arousal, I think the natural reaction of the other person is to lean back, which doesn't feel good to either of them. So it's like, how do I get this person to hold their energy differently? How do I get the responsive desire to know how to cultivate their desire and kind of move up the curve to enter into that, right? So if that's the case, I say, yes, absolutely. This couple can figure out how to navigate it if they're both willing to play a little bit with holding their energy and cultivating their energy. The second part to the question, maybe I'll pause there before I dive into the second part. Just like, yeah, I don't know if there's anything there that you want to comment on, or we want to dive deeper before I talk about the psychology part.
Well, I'll tell you what came up for me was just the idea of what each of these types might need in order to go deeper into themselves, because the person who goes from 0 to 100 and back is, on the one hand, potentially off-putting to other people because they can't find more delicate thresholds, but also they probably miss a lot of information about themselves that would occur in the gradient between 0 and 100. But then the other person seems like they almost seem mysteriously occluded from their own desire. They don't notice it. So they might need some kind of meta mapping of like, oh, this is how that starts. And I remember from last time that I actually do like this.
Right. Well, I think there can be two messages that those two people in partnership might start to adopt that won't be so great for them, right? So the person who has that spontaneous desire, they might start to feel like a little intrusive or a little ashamed of their desire and arousal. And they may, because they might notice their partner's kind of pulling back response. And so they might start to even think things like, well, my desire is bad, or I'm like bad for wanting this. And so I really want to bolster that person. I call it these like high five moments. So if they have desire and arousal, but their partner does it, it's still like high five your desire and arousal. That's an awesome part of you. It's so amazing. And yes, there's some growth we can do here in terms of maybe playing with more of this curve. And I also find those people, just that curve kind of, so let's say it's this sharp curve at the beginning when they've got this spontaneous thing, that curve does seem to flatten over a lifetime, I find, with a lot of people. And so helping those people also understand that this might shift over a lifetime, and they might either be relieved at that and feel more like their partner, or they might have some grief and loss about the loss of that. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of interesting things and growth possible for that person. I think for the other person, sometimes they can come to me feeling a little broken, like there's something wrong with them, versus knowing that no, you're actually functioning completely fine. And like you said, there's just so many like wonderful little things to explore here and to feel more empowered, that this is also something we can high five and celebrate.
Are these arousal patterns general characteristics of a person, or would some people have one of the patterns in one area of their life and another pattern in another area?
Yeah, great question. And I even think in a particular area, it can be contextual as well. Because I am so focused on sexuality, I'm digging into like my own personal experience here to kind of think about your question. And, I'm not sure how it might play out in other areas, but I know definitely within even the sexual realm, it can change in a situation. What I do often find though is if someone identifies as more that responsive desire and they're like, yeah, but sometimes it's spontaneous, and we explore the thing that is supposedly spontaneous, we find out it's actually not very spontaneous. So what I mean by that is they're like, yeah, well, yeah, sometimes when my partner says, if I want sex, I'll be like, yeah. And we'll explore, well, what just happened before that? And it was like a really good day with lots of close emotional connection, right? They spent some time doing like physical grooming. The space was cleaned up. And like, there was actually a tremendous amount of kind of preparatory work that had them feeling kind of already up the curve, even though it seemed like, oh yeah, I just asked and I was ready,
That fascinates me. I'm really intrigued by unseen preparation, probably in both these arousal patterns, because I think, one of the common things you hear are some people who thought it was spontaneously working really well at the beginning of the relationship, and now it isn't. And you say, well, why don't you try these different procedures? And they, well, I don't want to have to try anything. But if they actually carefully thought back to the beginning of the relationship, they were doing a lot of thinking, a lot of preparation, a lot of intentional modulation of
my
themselves
gosh.
and the other.
Yeah, I get that all the time, right? Or, couples will be like, well, I don't want to put it on the calendar. And I'll be like, okay, well, let's rewind back to when you first started dating, right? Did you put dates on the calendar? And they're like, well, yeah. And like, did you maybe do some special like body grooming or, prepare a space or, really put some thought into that experience? And you're right. It can feel spontaneous in the beginning of a relationship when it actually isn't all that spontaneous. And so, and there's this kind of like, it's going to be a funny analogy, but when my child was young, I hired a sleep consultant because I was like not getting enough sleep. I was like, I really need to figure out how to get this kid to sleep more. I was like, yeah, I'm playing around with like maybe no naps in the afternoon to see if he sleeps better at night. And she was like, no. She said, sleep begets sleep. The more sleep he gets, the more he can get sleep, right? And I think the same is true when it comes to sex, right? You cultivate, you bring this top of mind. It's like it kind of like creates itself. So for those couples who don't want a calendar, I'm like, well, how about try calendaring it and doing it this way, because that also probably will lead to more likelihood of the spontaneous stuff happening as well.
The mention of sleep is interesting to me because it brings up the whole area of what's physically required in order to allow our desire to be active and in order to act on it. Because, like things like Viagra induce blood circulation, right? So there'd be a lot of things like sleep, like diet, like general health and circulation. And I imagine because you have a sort of focus on feminine desire, the stereotypical problem of women feeling colder than men, the difficulty of the blood flow through their physiology. Like to what degree do you think about the physiological underpinnings of the capacity to embody desire?
Yeah, such a great question. I'll even just talk about like where is a person's nervous system, right? So are they in, this fight or flight sympathetic, nervous system space, either a lot or maybe chronically, right? Or are they in this parasympathetic, like I can rest and digest and have what I find for most people, not all, but most people, is that there needs to be some relaxation in the body to be able to access pleasure. It makes sense if we're in like fight or flight. So if I'm highly anxious, if I'm depressed, if I'm kind of in a frozen state, that my ability to be available to pleasure is not very important for survival in those moments, right? Whereas if I'm more like, okay, I'm getting adequate sleep, I have some exercise patterns that kind of reset my nervous system. I have, good social support systems. I'm not running myself ragged. These are actually, yeah, I mean, it's just like, I'm sure any topic we are dealing with, if someone is wanting to kind of experience, you know, pleasure in their life, it is kind of important to address the basics first. And I also feel that that's not gendered, right? I definitely, I used to be in tech. And so I got into this career because of my own struggles with feeling like, hey, I'm struggling accessing desire. But as my careers progress, like really understanding how desire shows up in the masculine or male presenting bodies as well is, it's honestly really the same. I can't tell you. I mean, obviously Viagra exists because there are lots of men who are suddenly, maybe there's a point in their life where they're like, wow, I'm struggling to get an erection or perform the way I want. And almost always really what's at play there is quite a bit of anxiety. So again, it's kind of like, okay, what's happening there, and what's going on, and how do we work with that, and in order for your body to have different possibilities.
One of the things I loved in your TED talk was this mention of how all these stories, cartoons, movies that involve romance and arousal sort of end with a kiss, right? Or they might end with a wedding. They don't. There's no sense of what comes next.
Right.
And so I guess the people who make those and the people who consume them they like the fact that it doesn't stray into that other territory and all the charge is contained in a kind of, family-friendly romantic fairy tale.
Right.
But what are we missing if our cultural entertainment, especially when we're young, doesn't really show us that desire is a follow-up to any of these things?
Right. Well, and what I'll say there is now maybe we can dive into the second part of that question we were answering long ago, which is, hey, are there ever times that people are incompatible? And I'm kind of laughing because I hadn't thought this before, but as you were talking about that question, I was like, oh, I know what turns the people on that made those films, right? What turns them on is like tension and anticipation, right? We don't get to see what happens because actually like the height of arousal for them maybe is that. Of course, they're also making friendly films and all that. But so some women that I studied with, they run an organization called the Somatica Institute, and the way that they describe this, and I really like it, is what is your hottest sexual movie, right? Because certainly there are also films that go into other illustrations of desire and arousal, and so I'll just kind of break this down into like a few key, well, actually, no. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give a very explicit example. Is that okay for this,
Yeah,
for the show? Okay. So we got the corner of my office back there, right? So we're going to imagine that there's like a couple back there and they're having sex and they look like they're having a great time. They're doing it doggy style. And, we're like, okay, well, clearly they're making lots of noise. They seem like they're having a good time. So that must be it, right? They do it doggy style and that's what gets them off. But if I were to take a microphone and go over there and interview them and say, hey, other than, just enjoying yourself, how else do you feel right now? Maybe this first couple, one of them says, oh, I feel very powerful. And the other one's like, oh, I feel very submissive, right? So that's one way, one thing they're getting out of sex other than getting off, right? I may go interview another couple. They're also doing it doggy style. I interview them. I say, other than turned on, how are you feeling? And they're like, oh, we feel so animalistic. They're like doing it doggy style. And so that's something else it might get out of sexuality, right? Is this animal kind of thing. I may go interview another couple and say, other than turned on, how do you feel? And they say, well, you're watching us, so we feel pretty naughty, right? And I give that illustration in context of this like hottest sexual movie context to say, if sex was just about getting off, we would probably all just masturbate. We can all, not all, but those who have practiced can do it in a few minutes, and it's a nice physical release. But there's something we get out of partnered sex that is psychologically important to us. Right? This is a place to play or to feel adventurous or to feel special or to feel abused or to feel used or to feel dirty or clean. There's just all of these things. And when I'm working with couples and kind of exploring this, like this concept of like, what really turns you on or what makes sex not just good, but like great for you, this is where this starts to come out, right? And so yeah, I mean, when you're back to that question of like, is there ever like an incompatibility, right? Yeah, sometimes your hottest sexual movie is totally different than mine. And so maybe I can come co-star in yours and you can come co-star in mine and we can have a fine sex life because we're willing to do that, right? But if yours holds zero appeal for me or mine holds zero appeal for you, maybe we can have an okay sex life, but not like those peak moments. Or maybe yours like actually turns me off, right? And so it's actually like really one of the really common ways this will show up for couples for me is that they'll both want to be submissive or like receptive. And so like no one's making a move because that's not, what turns them on is to how someone make a move on them. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty rare that it'll boil down to we really can't make this work, but it does happen.
thinking about interviewing them is fascinating because there's such an odd relationship between language and sexuality. And some people find it easy to talk about and difficult to do. Other people find it very easy to do and very hard to say anything about it. Or I guess I want to pivot a little bit to the question of the relationship between female sexuality and language. And I've known a lot of women who really enjoy visual pornography, but there are a lot of statistics saying there's a real lean towards the written word and narratives and language with women, much more so than men. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the same. I haven't dug extensively into the research, but the high level bit that I get is that male-bodied people, men tend to be a little bit more visually oriented, like in life, like they're just a little bit more visually oriented. And then that would maybe explain why they're, that is like, I think about it in terms of pathways to arousal, right? I could be maybe aroused through fantasy or vision, I could be aroused through, I'm like kind of going down those, right? Like it could be aroused by sounds, taste, by heart connection, by physical touch, by internal sensation. There's like all these different like kind of pathways to arousal. And I do think the literature says, hey, men might be a little bit more visually oriented. And women might be on whole a little bit less so, or have other pathways. Yeah. How much of that is like nature versus nurture? Not sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much it is inbuilt or evolves over time. If I think about myself, early on in my life, all I could get was written material. So it was very arousing. But as soon as I could get images readily, it was like easier, it's faster. So I'm like, maybe I'm just lazy.
Like that's a quicker hit. Yes. Well, and it's funny because there's an audio app out there. It's called Dipsy, and it's an app that just tells little short stories. And I do find that, I mean, their marketing is super geared towards women, and I find a lot of women like, reading or listening to things a little bit more. Now, there's also the reality that visual porn has been historically a male produced product. And so it might be more to the male gaze. And so in that way, I almost do wonder, like, would women be just as likely to be interested in more visual porn or erotic imagery if it were also more towards the female gaze? So there's definitely like ethically produced, female produced porn that I do get a lot of feedback from women that they're like, oh, that was really hot.
I find a lot of people I've spoken to, and they all have different takes on pornography, but a lot of their idea of it strikes me as very narrow and simple, as if they're thinking of 1980s pornography or something like that. That it's done in a certain way and it's for a certain gaze, and that there's a lot of truth to that historically. But what exists on the internet now is so diverse and so customizable that I think they really, and probably everybody goes into it exploring it only through the lens of their own interests. So they don't really understand what a multifarious and interactive
oh, there is porn for everything.
Again, on the topic of language, in your story about your own transformation, you make this move from initial self-discovery and self-work to talking about it with female friends and acquaintances. And I'm curious now, based on also your work with people, what is it that discussions, maybe particularly for women, but not exclusively, what is it that discussion brings forward that you couldn't get from just reading about things on the internet and trying them out in your life? What's the social conversational dimension? What do they get from that?
Yeah. And I think, I'm just having this visual. Helen Fisher, she's a love science researcher, and she's got this great visual of like men, like early ages, right? Like going out and hunting together, right? And it's like an activity, and they're not talking, they're looking at the prey, right? And it's like, and then she's got this visual of like women gathering around a circle, like, cooking or, doing the corn thing or whatever. And just as you were describing that, I'm just like, wow, just women for millennia have gathered to talk, and that has been their way of processing and feeling supported and inspired and encouraged. And so I do think there's almost something with the feminine that's like built in to have that be a nourishing space. So like, can you get that from reading or watching videos or things like that? Like maybe if you watched enough to get enough people's collective experience. But what I noticed and what I found in the research with women gathering is like, first of all, sexuality largely in most cultures and communities is something that is not discussed. It's a taboo topic. Like, I love that you guys are doing this series. Like, it's so cool. But you know, it's, if you go to a yoga class, right, then they're doing a body scan, or some meditation center, they're doing a body scan. They skip the genital region. Like, we're just like, we don't talk about this. And so I know for me, I had not talked about it either with any of my friends. And I was seeing a sex and relationship coach and realizing, oh my gosh, this is important stuff. We should talk about it. And so I reached out to my girlfriends, but they all had that similar thing. Like, they didn't talk about it. In fact, like when we were gathering together to begin with, they all put yoga pants on and told their partners they were going to yoga. Like, that's how much we don't talk about it. So at first there's just like relief that, oh my gosh, this is a topic we could talk about. And even that, you know, again, talking about just noticing our bodies and our reaction to that, even just recalling that moment now, my whole body relaxed. It was almost like I was holding my breath around sex. Like, I can't talk about this, right? And so there's just this like, oh my gosh, I can talk about it. And then in that talking about it, I find out I am not alone in my experiences. I was actually so nervous to talk about it in the beginning that I wrote like a Facebook post that I just put to a certain audience of a certain set of girlfriends, because like I couldn't even say it, you know, and they like all called me and messaged me like that same day. And so, and they called me and messaged me because they're like, oh my gosh, these experiences resonate. And so like you sit and you talk with a group of women or men, honestly, and yeah, you feel not alone. You feel supported. You hear experiences that are like yours. That's what helps you feel not alone. But you also hear some experiences that are not like yours. And those kind of, at least for me and for many of the women I watched go through this process, right? They kind of like, it's kind of like looking over there, that Here I Met Sally moment where it's like, I wonder what she's having. Like, that sounds good. Or maybe, oh, my situation's not so bad. Like, that sounds not great, right? So you have all these things where you get like inspired to maybe try or think about something differently than you would have before, all through just sitting in circle and talking.
That sense of the freedom of being able to discuss it, the relaxation of taking that off the table, the realization of not being alone, and the opportunity to see other pathways.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It's intriguing to me, there's a kind of double circuit or something between communication and perception. Because, you know, I've been surprised in my life to run into some women who at least tell me they've never looked at their vagina before or something like that. So in that sense, like you were saying about the body scanning, there might be a layer of perception where we're just not checking. It's there, we're not checking, and therefore we don't
most
have
women
to enter it into, we can't say it because we haven't checked on it. On the other hand, we might not be able to check on it until we have some kind of social linguistic communication that says it's okay, directs our attention there.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's just so strange, right? You've got the male anatomy that is like front and center on your body. It has been very obvious most of your life, right? And women have a maybe similar relationship. In the womb, we cup our genitals, right? It's a comfort. But certainly as we progress in life, most women get messages that part of their body is for something else. It's not for them, right? It's for their doctor to check on. It's, you know, something dangerous that has to be locked down because they'll get a disease or they'll get pregnant, right? They may have some, you know, not so great experiences with someone who has taken advantage of their body. And so they kind of like, oh, maybe this isn't for me. It's for someone else's pleasure. And so there's kind of a distancing to that part of their body that occurs throughout life. Plus, like, it is just freaking hard to look at, right? Because it's like between our legs, like we'd have to be a contortionist really to like be able to see it. And yeah, I do find as I'm working with women particularly that, yeah, we will try on different names for their body parts and just see how their bodies react. We will, talk about, well, how does it feel? What does pleasure feel like? Most women, when they come to see me, they're like, I don't even know if I'm having orgasms. Like, what does it, with men, again, it's like more clear, if you assume that ejaculation and orgasm are together, which not necessarily. Right. But yeah, this women's anatomy being so hidden in their bodies, right? I've got my little 3D clitoris over here, right? So you got this is what the clitoris actually looks like, but we always think about it like that little tiny nubbin, right? Which is actually hidden. So like, it's just, and this wasn't even in the anatomy books until I think 1990. Like, it's just actually quite incredible how obscure the female body is and how much it is not integrated. It is like offline. We're taught actually to be safe walking through the streets, to have that shut off,
So there's a set of messages to either ignore or demonize or shut off elements of the female experience of their bodies and their desire. How much of the problem do you think is the existence of those messages, and how much is the non-existence of counterbalancing messages? Because some of those messages might be very useful, especially in certain social contexts, but not if those are the only messages you get. So like, is it the negative messaging, because that could be destructive in and of itself, or is it the absence of a complementary positive messaging?
Yeah, I think I'd want to do a little bit of both and here, right? Like, there is some ways that the messaging that we are already getting, right, that you've kind of termed negative, is actually like intentionally negative or shaming. And I would want to kind of like do almost like a shame overhaul or a shame eradication. Like, I'd want to get rid of the shame in those messages, right? Like, oh my gosh, you need to shut this down because you're going to get a disease or you're going to get pregnant. It's like, I'd rather turn that into a message about like, hey, there's ways to keep this part of your body healthy. If you're not looking to become pregnant, there's ways to, navigate that. Or like, oh, it's, yeah, masturbation is a sin, right? I want to talk about like, and then of course there's this like positive, aspect and really a conversation about pleasure and how to find pleasure in your body. That, I mean, and it's true for men too, right? Like, I remember my son, I think when he was like in third grade, his teacher came to me and was like, hey, like, just notice like I was hanging out around the gym pole, like, which kids do, right? Like, they explore their bodies and like do these things. And I think any parent's kind of reaction to that is typically like, don't do that, or do that in your room, right? Like, it's almost like again, there's like this shaming aspect to it. Whereas I would like the conversation to be, and it wasn't our household, right? Like, it's like, oh, that feels really good, doesn't it? Like, yeah, like mommy does that and daddy does that and people do that. But it's also one of those things that, like, because it's a private part of your body, if you can't make sure that everyone around you is comfortable with that, you should probably do it someplace where you just don't have to ask, right? Because like, hey, you can masturbate in front of your partner, you can do those things, but so like having it be more of a pleasure conversation, a consent conversation, as opposed to a do it in private or don't do it conversation.
How much of what you're calling shame is, physiological anxiety response, a background impression you get from the tone of voice and the body posture and the micro gestures of the person? Like, I don't know what shame would be except without that, because even if somebody gave you a very positive message, if you could see they were bothered by it, you might still get that same effect. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely how I identify shame in a session with a client, is physiological, right? It's the looking down, it's the constriction, making themselves smaller. They're just as we went back in the beginning, right? Like there is part of shame that is a brain thing. It's a message, right? But it creates in us this desire to shrink, to be small, to minimize. And so they're like kind of inextricable. And, if you even go back to the conversations with women, like part of that is, it's like, I don't have to have that response in my body. I can start to rewire my brain to perceive this whole situation differently. I love how you're saying, like, even if the message is right, but the physiological message is different, right? That was one of the surprise findings of my research when I looked at, like 300 women getting together, in groups of like 4 to 8. What the surprise finding was, not only did they have all the things we just talked about, right? They felt normalized, like supported, encouraged, inspired. What they also got was they were all able to speak to their kids much more easily than they were before, right? If the kid had a question about sex before, they demonstrated all of these physiological signs that we're talking about of being like a shameful or nervous or whatever. And after they'd been able to have those conversations with their friends, and a kid has a conversation, they're like, yeah, like, let's talk about that. And they're so much more relaxed, and they had the language, and the body matched the language.
It's very inspiring to think of an emerging intergenerational wisdom, a dharma of sexuality. I'm curious about, the whole notion of sexual education in kids. And because one of the things that characterizes trauma is that something's too intense or too soon for them to process. And yet there's things you need to hear before you're bringing them up. So how do you strike that balance? When is what kind of communication appropriate and healthy with children relative to sexuality and desire in general?
Yeah. It is such a unique thing for each child too. I just want to say, right? Like this answer really is that it depends on the child. There's this one series of books that for the parents who are not so comfortable talking, just on their own with their kids, they can get these books, and they're almost like comic books. They're on my website at the bottom of the books page. But what I love about these comic books is they have a bird and a bee in each of the corners of the comics. And I think the bird is really excited to talk about sex and wants to know all of the things, right? And the bee is like, I don't want to talk about it. Like, let's not talk about it, right? And so I like that because it shows that kids are unique, right? Like some kids are going to be the kids that ask a million questions about everything, including sex. And other kids are going to be those kids who don't. They're the quiet kids in class. They're like, I don't have any questions. It's cool, And both of those are really normal. And we still also want to provide information, right? So for the kids who are asking questions, my advice to parents is to answer those questions in a limited way and let them ask more, right? You don't need to dive into the very, very specific nitty-gritty details, but usually those kids are going to kind of guide the conversation themselves. For the other kids who are not asking questions so much, right? It's taking little opportunities along the way their entire childhood. Right. So when they're 2 or 3, there might not be much conversation, but there might be some, like, like mommy and daddy kiss because we like each other, right? Or like it's just like a little tiny little snippet, right? And having, right now, for instance, my son who's older, he's 13. Every now and then we watch Friends together. And there will be a scene. By the way, Friends is entirely about sex. I did not know that when I was first watching it. But now when I watch it, my 13-year-old, I'm like, wow, this is like just about sex. But we'll take a moment, we'll pause the show, and some scene has just happened with some euphemism or something. And I'll say, do you know what that means? And sometimes he'll surprise me and he'll say, yes, mom, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, wow, okay. And other times he'll say no. And then I'll ask him, well, do you want to know? Do you want to know what that means? Right. So at this age, we're able to have much more frank conversations. But when they're younger, it'll be, a shorter conversation. But I do think the books are amazing. There's books, there's one from like 4 to 7, 7 to 10, 10 to 13, and then there's like some teen books, and those can be extremely useful if you're not sure.
Those sound like fantastic resources.
Mm-hmm.
I get along a similar vein. Have you found a reasonably high correlation between women who masturbate earlier in life, say, and those who are more familiar with their pleasure pathways and response systems later in life?
Not necessarily, right? Even taking my own self as an example, right? I learned how to masturbate when I was like 6 years old from a girlfriend. I always did it in private, and it was quick and short. And I did not have at least a conscious understanding, embracing easy access to desire and arousal, right? So that's an example of like, hey, masturbated whole life, but I still struggled. What I will say in general, and I'll kind of like, so there's a big consent conversation going on in the outside world, right? And that consent conversation looks like, hey, make sure that you're talking with someone before you do something with them and make sure they consent, which is a great conversation to have, right? I'm really glad that conversation is happening in the world. But it is like actually practically useless if we have not also provided women and men with the skills to have an internal consent conversation first. And so internal, when I think about that, like what is an internal consent conversation? What does that even mean, right? So like someone says, do you want sex? And I just like in my brain think, well, yes, I do. Cause like, you're a good person. On paper, you look good. I should want to. And it's something we're supposed to do. And so yes, right? That's like an external consent conversation, right? Without an internal. Internal is kind of like, well, what's going on in my body? Am I leaning in? Am I feeling desire and arousal? Do I want this? Am I in the, like, what do I want? And it's like, it's a real internally focused checking in with my body and what my body is telling me in this moment. And so I do find that women who have masturbated, back to your original question here, right? Women that have masturbated oftentimes do have a little bit more connection with how desire and arousal shows up in their body, at least in a particular way. I think most people, when they masturbate, they do it one specific way. And so it's kind of like hardwired that one thing. And so, that can be helpful.
You connected more to the skill of somatic mindfulness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. The different forms that sexual desire shows up in intrigues me, just from your description there, because, like this top list, superficial yes. And you're like, what relationship does that have to our deeper desires on the one hand? Because we might say yes and we didn't actually check. On the other hand, our yes, it seems like it might go into other areas, right? There's a whole psychological literature of, your religious zeal or your anger or your interest in race cars or whatever it might be, could be theoretically drawing on your sexual energy in a way that isn't sexual and moving it from the system where it's supposed to operate into some ancillary system of the unit. It's very, so what do you think about what are the types of desire? Can they be ranked? Can they be organized? Is it a haphazard field? When is the presence of desire not really desire? And when is the presence of something else actually desire?
Wow, so interesting. I just like, as you're saying that question again, I'm just like feeling into my body. I'm like, what is that like? Right. And I'm laughing because like, as I became more connected to my, you might call it the sacral chakra or the root chakra, or like this space in my body that, holds this, feeling, this felt sensation of erotic desire, right? So there's that. And then, does that also like inform, can it be connected? Can it flow more through my body? Can it inform other things? And I'm laughing because as I've been doing this work, before I was like kind of offline, it was like a big black hole down there and it wasn't part of my everyday experience. And now like my closest friends will joke if, let's say I'm trying to decide where I want to go to vacation, that I want to go this place or do I want this meal or that meal? What do I desire, right? And my close girlfriends will know, is they'll be like, well, what would your pussy say? You know, like checking in, like using this part of myself to actually, you know, feel into the other aspects of desire. So for me, it's actually a little bit more of like a cultivated thing. It's like, let me, and I do this with clients in a way, like I'll put in my office space here, right? We'll have like a drawing of the heart, of the genitals, of the mind, of the spirit on different corners of the room here, and have this person actually embody these different parts of themselves. What does your spirit desire? What does your mind desire? What does your body desire? What do your genitals desire? And so I don't know, I guess what I'm starting to think is like, there might be this like unconscious way that plays out, right? Where maybe I'm a person that really lives in my genitals, or I really live in my spirit, you know, I'm one of those people that's like a little floaty, or more like spiritual bypassy kind of thing, right? Or someone who's very in my physical sensation, right? And so unconsciously, maybe I'm oriented towards just the wisdom of one part of my body or my mind, right? But with this work, what would it be like to have this more integrated sense to make decisions or to desire things like from a more full human experience? You know, it's just where my mind and my body is going.
Yeah. It's like two sides to the notion of integration-based development. One of them is to include all of the systems that we have at our disposal. The other one is to increase the richness and complexity with which we're perceiving and thinking about things. And that increase of nuance really intrigues me. I have this pet theory about serial killers, that they have a kind of limbic fusion where their urge to have sex, to eat, to attack, and to flee, they all come online at the same time. If they get one of those urges, they get all of the urges, and they try to do all of them at the same time, and it's an evil disaster. So, health in that case would look like a more nuanced teasing apart of those functions. And I wonder if, from your point of view, you see a pattern like that. Is there an increase of nuance where there's an increase of well-being and ownership of desire?
Absolutely. Yeah, as you're talking about, I'm like, oh, that's really exciting, right? I'm going to give a funny story to illustrate this point. But there's this woman, her name is Pamela Madsen, and she runs these retreats called Back to the Body retreats. They're for women. There's a men's equivalent called the Apollo Project. And she works with these practitioners called sexological body workers. And what this work looks like is the practitioner is in service to a client who is looking to explore kind of their erotic understanding and potential. And so the practitioner is fully clothed and they have gloves on their hands. The client may be naked if they choose. And there's kind of a supported exploration of the client's body to erotic and aroused states. And so Pamela hosts these retreats where she has a whole bunch of practitioners, a whole bunch of female clients. And early on in the retreat, she does a demo. And what this just set the scene for what this demo looks like is there's a massage table, there's lovely music, there are some vibrators and toys off on the side, and there's her practitioner, right? And this practitioner is basically helping support her on this massage table, lean into her erotic pleasure. What is so lovely about this is like, you're like maybe like 40 minutes into her demo. She's naked. She's like doing yoga poses on the table. She is screaming. She is moaning. This practitioner is just trying to keep up with her, right? And she will pause in this demo and she will look out at the women and she will look you straight in the eye and she will say, I have not yet orgasmed. And all the women are kind of like, I mean, we're sweating, we're like turned on, we're just like, what are you talking about, right? Like, if anyone was to watch that, you would assume there had been like 30 orgasms. And so what I find in this work and it's this question of nuance and richness, is that there is so much more potential that is so not realized in the average person's experience of their sexual selves, of arousal and desire. There's just so much that this increased body awareness, this, eradication of shame, this understanding of all of the possibilities in this amazing 52 card deck that we have, creates just this, like, she jokes that she's creating sexual Olympians. Totally agree with, right? It's kind of like the nuance of the sport, right? You'd never imagine that was possible with running or discus throwing or whatever in the Olympics, right? And the same with this sexuality. So I do think there can be this richness in the exploration that taps into, oh my gosh, yeah, I'd like arousal right here in my little part of my wrist. Like, what?
You described her as helping women to lean into their pleasure. And the phrase lean in was, I think it was popularized by a book about women in business.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if there's a general feminine need for that lean in move, because it seems like, yeah, absolutely. You could grow up without a lot of contact with your own desire for a number of personal and domestic and social reasons. But you might grow up with a reasonable amount of contact with your desire and a problem bringing that to the table or making that little move of introducing it into your life and with other people.
Yeah, the word that's coming to mind for me as you say that is permission. So let's not even do an internal consent conversation, because that assumes the person on the other side believes that they, have the right to consent or are available to consent, right? And now let's even just break it down into an earlier phase, which is just, do I have permission to go there, right? What role models do I have? What messages do I have? Do I have permission to show up at work? No, you were told to be a homemaker, like stay at home, right? Or you present an idea at work and it gets smashed on, right? It's like, do I have permission from you? Did I take on your non-permissioning, and I don't permission myself, right? So I think that to me is the work, like Sheryl Sandberg with Lean In, which was launched when I was at Facebook under Sheryl Sandberg. So I am definitely close to my heart there. And yeah, with Pamela, it's like that. And I think that's what's so powerful about demos with sexuality, which is a fairly radical form of education, right? We don't get that. Like when I described that, I think most people would listen to me like, that is crazy. I certainly thought it was crazy when I experienced it the first time. It doesn't seem so crazy to me anymore, but it's like, there is, in seeing that, even hearing about it, there is such permission granted to be like that. Men need similar positioning. I can't tell you how many couples I see, and I'm like, so when he orgasms, like, what does it sound like? And most people are like, it sounds like this. Like, wait, what? It's like, do you have permission to like lean into your pleasure and to make sounds and how hot that is to have that? Like, there's just so much permission. Like, we can get rid of the shame. That at least gets us to a neutral space. But then there's all this permissioning that I want to layer on top of it, starting with, because certainly external non-permissioning has seeped into us, and then like unwinding it all.
So there's a basic layer in terms of showing up and diffusing shame. And then there's this next layer or additional process of giving permission. Through conversation, through demonstration, through a tone, things like that. And you change your behavior as you select from the things that you now have permission to do. But is there a next phase? Like, how does a person go from getting permission to being able to give themselves permission?
I think that is a little bit through experimentation and safe spaces, right? So I remember, I'll give an example, a personal example, right? I was with that coach that I was working with, and I remember at one point she's like, okay, well, touch your arm and then like show me that you like it, right? So I'm like touching my arm and I'm being pretty quiet. I'm definitely not moving like this. And she's like, I'll help you. And she comes right behind me, right in my ear. She starts moaning while I'm touching my arm, like just all out moaning. I thought it was hilarious. I was like, whatever, that's so theatrical, like. So there's a little bit of like modeling there, right? I still am not giving myself permission to do it, right? But through trying it on in a space where I know that it will be received well, either maybe that's just on my own, right? Because I'm the only one that has to receive that, or with a partner that I know if I bring out a vibrator instead of feeling, like that is some slight on their confidence or competence, right? They go, yeah, bring it on, right? There's all these little ways that we can kind of like run safety checks on trying something new. And then if it is safe, try it and then find out whether that helps or not. And if it does, you've granted yourself a little bit of permission to maybe go further next time. Right. And so there's just these like little steps. And I think, yeah, if you run the safety check and there's some shame that comes back at you, to not take on that shame is the work, right? Say, okay, well, that person's just not available for that. Too bad for them. So don't have that set you back. And then like find that safe space and go there a little bit and start that rewiring process to be more and more and more.
There's such a wealth of sub skills involved in all of this, right? From checking somatically to learning desire to learning boundaries to this whole sexual Olympics thing, and just being able to recognize pleasure. And like you were saying, can you demonstrate pleasure? Like that's a whole subset of skills and possibilities and training and years. It seems so huge. At the moment, we're addressing it, through people like you in a way, people who are providing local and very often monetized supplemental education for people in their life. But do we need to put this closer to the core of our education system? Like, is pleasure, is hedonics a core curriculum feature? And are there civilization problems we're never going to address until everybody's working on something like this for a long period of time?
Yeah, such a great question. Yeah, I'm going to give two answers because I've got the answer that I kind of normally give. And then as you're talking, I'm kind of thinking of something else too. So the answer I normally give is I'm not actually super worried about the children at the moment because actually children really understand that pleasure is a birthright. I mean, look at any 1-year-old and they're putting everything in their mouth and touching and tasting and like, they get it. Not super worried about that age. I am definitely worried about adults giving them crappy messages around pleasure. You're dirty at the park, wipe off your hands, don't get in the mud, don't get in the sand. Like definitely worried about that. So I am much more concerned and focused on education for adults because again, like just what I found with the women who got more comfortable talking about it, they could then talk to their kids. And then I'm not worried about the shame or non-pleasure-based education being passed along to the children. So I say that first, it just to talk about that. So, and I do think that there's definitely a space when we're talking about decision making, when we're helping kids learn how to make decisions, right? I think there is a big focus on what is right or what is wrong or the logical part. And I think teaching some body awareness, whether that's, teaching them meditation and how to connect with their bodies or different things like that are very helpful things to do with young children. So I don't even think it needs to be focused on sexuality per se, but just making sure that they're staying connected with the wisdom of their bodies so that it can be employed for sexual purposes, when their bodies are in that space, could be a nice addendum to working with adults around sexuality.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued. I mean, I think you're right that a lot of the problem gets solved if you can make a wise, healthy membrane in the messages that adults are sending to children and clean that circuit up.
Yeah.
But it also seems like so many of the problems that we see start to arise among adolescents and younger adolescents who are naturally trying to do things, whether it's sexuality or drinking and drugs or other forms of pleasure, and they have no pleasure instruction. They don't know how to do it in a way that maximizes their enjoyment and minimizes their self-destruction.
Right.
So it seems like there's a field available there, but I don't know what its significance would be going forward.
Yeah, for sure.
You talked about parental response to dirty kids in the park. And it made me think of a thing, because for a few years of my life, I would be in this one particular public washroom at this government building in Victoria. And I would see the same thing all the time. I would see other men come in, use the urinal, and then wash their hands and go back to work. And I thought, well, everything is telling me on the news that this is the dirtiest part of your body. It touched everything. It's corrupt. And then you take that and you put that on your genitals, and then you wash your hands because genitals are dirty.
Oh my gosh, I've never thought about that before, but yeah. Like, just watch where you put that later, right? Oh, yeah. I mean, I do think that, I talk about the surprise finding with research. I think the surprise finding myself when I was getting more in touch with my body and with pleasure was that my capacity for play just really shifted. I was definitely the mom that, like, if I took the kid to the amusement park that also had some water rides, that I would be like, either don't go on that, or we have to have just the right outfit that's going to dry perfectly, or we have to have the second outfit. And certainly I wasn't going to go on those things, right? Because, not go walk around in wet shoes all day. Like, I just had this like very interesting, and I think common, I was the mom in the park who sat on the bench, right, and watched her kids play. And as I had this like shift to more of a pleasure orientation, I found myself, I remember one scene at like, I don't know, Great America or something like that. And I was sitting on the bench, as you do, watching my kid about to pull this huge bucket of water that was like filling above his head. It was about to like fall down on him. Right. And I remember like watching that, and I didn't have any spare clothes. There was no plan for this. I didn't know it existed. And I just jumped up and I ran towards him, not to get him out of the way, but to be there with him when the water fell. And that moment really stands out because, there's just such a different orientation towards that experience. And I feel like it was a direct result of all the work that I had done around sexuality.
I would imagine that some of that is letting go of control, and some of that is sensual affirmation, sensual things taking a bigger share of your experience, and some of it is freeing energy that might be bound. But I'm curious about like the skill of converting disgust into pleasure, right? Like we can see things and go, oh, are they dirty or are they not? And that's kind of an interpretive option that you have. And there seems to be this procedure we perform where we go from feeling gross to feeling attractive, or, you want me to put my mouth where, right? You have something that's could either go into disgust or go into pleasure if I have the resources or approach that performs that alchemical conversion.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about the ability to get better at that.
Oh, I love, love, love this question. It shows up a lot in my work. It goes back to that very first answer of, am I in my brain or am I in my body? I will have people that will come to me and they'll be like, I have this thing that turns me on, and I don't like it. And so there's disgust, almost disgust at themselves for this thing that they know that they like. And that's a more obvious way that this shows up. A lot of times it just shows up like, I don't like that thing. And they're not even aware that they actually do like that thing, right? And so the work that I see around that kind of shift from disgust to maybe delight is, first of all, normalizing it. I think a lot of people, let's say this is a very common desire, is to be controlled in a way. Maybe this looks like, hey, I like rape porn, or I want my partner to put their hand on my neck, or, this it's stuff that you're like, well, I don't think I should like that because I don't think I actually want that. But there is a physiological response to that. And so, when I'm working with clients around, okay, do you want to be disgusted or do you want to be delighted with that particular stimulus or this activity, putting your feet in mud, whatever, is to normalize, first of all, that is something that someone might feel delight for. In fact, maybe a lot of people might feel delight for, and that's normal, and doesn't mean you necessarily want to be raped or you want to be muddy all the time, but that it's normal for people to enjoy that experience. Because a lot of people don't think it's normal. They really don't. They're like, this is abnormal. I need to fix myself, right? And so, to first of all explain this is normal. You're in good company. That's, tending to the brain a little bit. And sometimes that does start to relax the body. And then it is a focus on the body. Well, let's just check out what is true of your body, because we probably can't actually change what is true for your body. You can become more aware of it and we can choose different behaviors, but what is true for your body is probably true for your body, right? And so, like if it's the mud thing, right? Let's really slowly, oh, hello, doggy. Let's really slowly put your hands in some mud. And let's just see what it's like. Let's really observe the nuance of this experience and what it's like, right? Or like, let's talk about someone putting their hand on your neck. And let's really observe the nuance of this experience in your body and what it does for you and how that might be a good thing instead of a bad or disgusting thing, right? And when we kind of pair those two things, this is a normal human experience. It's not necessarily disgusting, right? Or maybe in certain circumstances that we can create, it would not have that layer of disgust. And what does your body tell you about it? And that, and sometimes what we'll discover is, okay, well, I can't get over disgust for that thing. But as we're exploring the nuances, we've got 10 more things that might get you that thing. So now we've learned from this thing that disgusts you that we can't seem to rewire, and created this whole other set of things that you can really truly enjoy, both in brain and body, mind and body. Yeah.
I like that notion of it as a way into a field of possibilities that might provide that experience if you're capable of allowing that experience.
Right. I mean, take something as simple as our doggy style example, right? Like that may just anatomically, physically not work for some people. But if we learned through the imagination of it that they really want to feel naughty, and we want to keep them safe in society, right? We can come up with a whole world of possibilities of things that might enable that same feeling for them, with some safety and actual reality for being able to do. Yeah.
I'm thinking about what's true for our body in terms of arousal as having like a general and a specific component. Like if someone enjoys, if the idea of rape is arousing and true for the body, that could be very specific, like they're turned on by that as opposed to other things. Or it could be very general, which is it has the general shape of sexuality. I mean, years ago, I saw a British study and these women lived in a house together, and they were tested in various ways. And one of the ways was they were shown images. And one of the images was, I think, gorillas having sex or something like that. They all subjectively reported no arousal and their brains showed arousal. So the question is, are they turned on by a potentially dirty element of gorillas having sex, or is their brain just recognizing the archetype of sexuality in general and booting it up, but it would need several other things in order to become an actual desire?
Yeah. So I think this is, I love that you're bringing this up, right? So there's a study, right? So it's actually not their brains registered arousal. They had something called the plasmograph, like in the vagina, measuring arousal and blood flow, right? And so, yeah, it's like concordance and non-concordance between my mind and my body in concordance, or are they not, right? And so I want to just like expand this. And there's I call this, how explicit can I be with my language?
Go as far as you like. We've got a pretty sophisticated audience.
Great. So I imagine I have like my little book of fairy tales here next to my little basket of fairy tale books, and I pull one out, and this is the myth of the hard cock and the wet pussy. I like that term. Sometimes with clients, I'll use the more like clinical terms. But what I'm bringing this fairy tale book into the conversation here is that we have these myths, these things in our mind that hard penis equals desiring person, right? They have desire. Wet pussy, wet vagina is someone who is ready and desiring of sex. Not true. Let's just break and bust that myth, right? We can have someone who is erect and hard, who is actually not feeling a lot of desire in this situation. We can have someone wet who is not feeling desire in this situation. We can have someone who is not erect, who is feeling a lot of desire in this situation, and someone who is not wet and feeling a lot of desire. So this idea that the body and the brain's measurement of desire have to be in alignment, or should be in alignment, or will always be in alignment is just not true. And so I think that is a very important starting point, because we are more complicated creatures than that, right? And so, yeah, when I'm working with men around that, it's like, wow, actually what shows up for you around erection is dictated by societal norms that you should get hard, be hard, and stay hard, right? Like it's just not actually how the body works. Like sometimes you can feel pleasure and not have that, that type of quote functioning, right? Or sometimes you can, have the reverse, and same for women. And so it is more complicated than that. Like in that specific example you gave, like they're seeing that happen. Their body just may be signaling to them, hey, you should be ready for this if it happens. Like lubricate, because if that happens to you, that will make it better for you physiologically, right? Or not as painful. So there's just so many reasons that may or may not be. So it gets back to that kind of integrated human experience that we're talking about. I think, am I a yes on all fronts, and not just one front? I can't tell you how many times I'll talk with couples and a partner will get a signal from a woman's body that she is feeling arousal, but she won't be communicating clearly enough, or they will be escalating because they got that signal and it is too fast for the woman to have kind of that experience of pleasure that she's looking for. Whether it's her being wet or her moving her hips or whatever. And so as they both become more dialed into each other's experiences and more communicative, oh yeah, moving my hips means I like this, keep going, not escalate. Or yeah, like this particular thing, or when I say this thing, yes, escalate, I'm very ready for it. Or no, I want to say yes, but then I want you to make me beg because that's my turn on, right? So there's just so much nuance to that.
This is an area where I think the desire discrepancy issue really has has great significance, because a lot of the exploration of the nuances between concordance and non-concordance and different possibilities and different moments, that's a very rich terrain to explore, and it's hard to explore under a scarcity mentality model, right? If you always feel like you're trying to make up for absence, then you never really feel like you have the abundance to relax and look at different outcomes that might be successful.
Yeah. This is true, like emotionally, this is true physically. If my cup is empty for the thing that I need, I will feel very scarce, and I will show up in a way that actually is probably less likely to get my cup filled. Whereas when my cup is full, I am able to show up in a way where I'm more likely to even get more in my cup, and I certainly have a lot in my cup to give to another. And so that is really challenging, right? If there's a relationship where there's been desire discrepancy for a period of time, which is very common, both cups will be quite empty. So where do you start? No one has anything to give, right? And, I think probably most listeners of the show know you start within yourself. you have to first give yourself what you need. And if that doesn't feel possible, you go find someone like a therapist who can help give you what you need until you can give it to yourself, until you get full enough that you can enter into partnership in a different way, in a different state. That is so hard for couples to hear. It's so hard because they just want that other person to change and give them what they need. And they're just not very attractive in that state. And so no one wants to give them anything. It's really, yeah, it's a hard puzzle.
There's a long tradition of people opposing their spiritual life to their mortal pleasures.
Right.
I'm curious about whether you've found people tending to come across a more sacred dimension of sexuality as they freely explore it.
Yes, there are definitely people who really, like when we talk about the hottest sexual movies, these are people that I would consider more energetically oriented, right? They really, their description of sex is this extremely powerful and intense sharing of energy, and it has this spiritual connotation. They may see colors, they may, fly to other dimensions. It's just this very, and I say this all in a dreamy voice because I tend to have some leanings that way, right? Yeah, I mean, I love Celeste and Danielle, who are the founders of the Somatica Method. They have the saying, and they say, there's no one right way to lead a sex life. And certainly, if you want to harness the power of your sexuality and not be explicitly sexual and store that all up in other ways and have this thing like mad props to you, like amazing, right? I don't think many mere mortals actually function well that way in this like human skin bag form that we're walking around the world currently in, right? I think most mere mortals and humans, I'll oftentimes the way that this will show up is with a guy who has come to me and said, I read this thing and it said I shouldn't masturbate because I'm releasing this energy and I want to hold it all, and that's going to make what sex I do have better. And I think that's lovely. Like if that's actually how their body works, amazing. And that's how their brain and everything works, great. Most of the time for mere mortals and humans that I'm working with, when I explore that with them and explore what is true for their body, some of those clients will actually find, yes, if I masturbate, I actually release that energy and I don't have like the energy I want for work or the energy I want for my partnership. And so I'm going to masturbate less or not at all because that's how my body works. And I learned something through this. Other clients will say, actually, gosh, I thought I wasn't supposed to do that and release that special energy. But when I do that, I actually am more available for relationship and have more energy for work and my other endeavors. And so, I guess I need to rethink that thing that I was taught in this spiritual context or whatever. And so I really do encourage clients to explore what is true for them, regardless of what they might be told or what readings they might be or what communities they might be in. So yeah, again, it's back to that, just it's unique for everybody. Let's see what's true for you.
I'm also curious about the way that desire might show up and not present itself to a person as desire. Sometimes in my life, I've thought that, my mind starts wrestling with the problem of sexuality in my relationship, whether it's desire, discrepancy, or anything else. And then I get to points where I think, oh, that's not the problem of sexuality. That's just sexual desire. I'm not recognizing it as desire. It's tangled up in a knot, but if I untangle the knot, it's just wantingness, which is okay for me to feel. And it looks like there's a similar pattern among a lot of women in terms of thinking about desire as the desire of the other, that sexuality is something that other people want or someone else wants. It has this other form. And in terms of owning your own desire, a lot of that, I'm imagining, for women has to do with teasing apart the desire energy from situations in their life that might have been really about someone else's desire and not their own. Like Like, how do you separate the alien part from the part that's yours, especially if you wanted to reclaim desire from all your life experiences? A lot of those are weird, gross things that impinge upon you, and yet they were moments of you being desired and connecting with desire, and some of that is your recognition of what desire is. So how do you separate this?
Oh gosh, it's such a good question. And what I'm hearing you say basically is like, okay, there is this feeling of desire in my body, this feeling of wanting. I think most people, when I talk to them about that feeling and we like feel it for a second, oh yeah, I remember when you wanted that thing, whether it was like the pizza in front of you or that person over there, right? I think there's kind of like almost like unanimous agreement that like that feels good. Wanting feels good. A lot of clients that come to me that haven't felt that in a long time, they're like, I just want to want, you know? So like that's its own thing. Like you said, we really want to separate that out. And I think that is such a lovely thing to celebrate, right? Like it, regardless of what we do with that want, you know, it's almost separating it from the object being desired to just like, wow, this feeling of want is nice. You know, or like I love that because it gives such permission for that part of ourselves to be turned on, but it doesn't need to splatter over the people or things we might be wanting, right? It's just for us, like just this yummy, like good thing. So yes, I want to very clearly pull that out and give ownership to the person to be in total control of that. You can create it within yourself. You can have it just be for yourself. And gosh darn it, it feels good. There's that. Now, there's this separate thing of like, hey, is being desired part of my hottest sexual movie? Does it take any desire that I might already be showing up with inside myself and now create a positive feedback loop between me and another? That's not feeling desire. That is, I like to be desired. Some people like that. Some people don't, right? Like some people have that's part of their hottest sexual movie and some people it's not. And so for those people who do like that, and you're right, like it can get gunked up from earlier experiences of maybe being desired, which felt good because like we all do kind of, I mean, it's kind of nice, even if it's not your hottest sexual movie, it is kind of nice to feel desired a lot of the time. But maybe it wasn't the right contextual situation for that. And I think this is an interesting thing about just like, I mean, I think we know with psychology, right? Many of our childhood experiences shape our coping mechanisms and ways of walking through the world and how we feel love. And I think it's also true erotically. Those things can shape. Let's say I did have some situations that maybe have made me the type of person who the type of person who needs to feel control in my life because I didn't feel a lot of control as a child. So I tried to, you know, control things. And so now erotically, I will probably do one of two things in terms of my hottest sexual movie. I will either want to be the person in control or the person not in control. I could play out either way sexually if I had that type of experience when I was a child. And so, yeah, I think I want to tease apart like having access to desire within yourself and how good and wonderful that wanting feels. Ask a separate question of, does your core erotic theme, as Jack Moore in another book back there would say, or hottest sexual movie like my other mentors would say, does that have an element of liking to be desired, and how do we get to play with that in a good and safe way? Yeah, and then the additional layer of and what others, if it's not to feel desired, what other psychological things might you like to feel in an erotic sense?
Well, I'm out of questions. Is there anything else you think we should talk about?
Oh gosh. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what I'm taking away this morning in the conversation is just a reminder to myself to give myself permission for pleasure in life. I think we can get so focused on so many other things and I certainly was prior to starting this line of work. And so, yeah, I think whatever that is, maybe it's that and sensual pleasure, right? To be a feeling being in this world. I know after this, I'm going to go make myself a latte with foam, and I'm going to like smell it and taste it and hopefully have my whole body experience that pleasure. And yeah, I think it's just something we're not necessarily oriented to do, but can be so rich and so enlivening.
Well, I found this to be a very, very clear and comfortable conversation. I'd like to thank you. And also, I'd like to thank the couple having doggy style sex in the corner behind you.
I mean, they've been so
Very
busy.
useful. This has been terrific, Pam. Thanks very much for joining us.